Hello and welcome to the May 2020 Bushwalking New South Wales General Meeting. We are so incredibly fortunate that Professor David Bowman has so kindly accepted our invitation to speak on how bushwalkers and outdoor adventure enthusiasts can adapt to the new bushfire conditions. Professor David Bowman is Professor of Pyrogeography and Fire Sciences at the University of Tasmania. However, before David was a distinguished scientist, he was a bushwalker. And in this talk, David will take you on a journey that you might find changes both your heart and mind in a very surprising way. But firstly, I wish to welcome you to this presentation that is brought to you by Bushwalking New South Wales. I am Kirsten Mayer, Executive Officer of Bushwalking New South Wales, and I wish to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we walk and live within. I recognise their continuing connection to land, water and community. I pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. On this occasion in particular, for their wisdom in caring for country, which we are so fortunate to engage with through outdoor adventure. Bushwalking New South Wales represents and supports bushwalkers, hikers and outdoor adventurers in New South Wales and the ACT. We support our 69 clubs with information, insurance, conservation and tracks and access advocacy. We made submissions to the New South Wales and federal bushfire inquiries along with Bushwalking Australia. Our 69 clubs are located across New South Wales and the ACT. They run over 10,000 adventures each year in New South Wales, ACT, Australia and the world. So if you aren't already a member, look for a club near you on our website at bushwalkingnsw.org.au. Our clubs would love to welcome you. Tonight we are doubly blessed in many ways with not one but two Davids. Bushwalking New South Wales also has a David Bell, our Vice President, Conservation Officer and Tracks and Access Officer. Our David is the guy on the left here, and our David will ask your questions of our presenter, David Bowman. But firstly, to introduce you to our presenter, David Bowman, you'll now hear Bill Boyd, who is President of Bushwalking New South Wales, giving an introduction to David Bowman's talk and Q&A session. Bill Boyd is also a geographer, and you can occasionally catch Bill's video image at the top left of the screen. Enjoy spotting Bill, and I do hope you enjoy the wonderful narrative shared by David Bowman.
David is quite a person worth having around. You will have seen from the flyer that he is also a professor in the University of Tasmania, and he's given himself the title Professor of Pyrogeography and Fire Science, which I think is a truly wonderful title. And it's more imaginative and exciting and meaningful really than one of his previous titles, which was Professor of Environmental Change Biology, which is really important stuff, but typical university type title. Once you get into pyrogeography and fire science, you're into something which is right at the core of the Australian landscape and right at the core of Australian identity. It's so important from so many points of view. We've experienced in certain ways why that has been over the last 6 months or more, in fact. But from the point of view of a geographer, from the point of view of an ecologist, anybody that's interested in the countryside that we recreate in as bushwalkers, our understanding of fire is absolutely crucial. And at times it can be, well, more than crucial, it can be life-saving if we make sure that we get it right. We're at a time of change with the COVID crisis and the social and political responses that have been brought down upon us in response to it. And I say that carefully because our lockdowns and our lack of ability to go bushwalking is not caused by the virus, it's caused by the political and social responses to it. And I say that because, again, when we come back to the topic of fire, there's a lot to be known about fire from a natural science point of view, but there's as much to be known from the social response to it and the social adaptation. I expect, I don't want to put words into David's mouth, but I would not be surprised if he's going to give us at least those two sides of the issue of fire and perhaps more. I think I need to turn off my mic and I need to welcome David to talk to us. He's going to give us a talk through, I expect, his career and whatever comes into his mind. He knows we're a group of bushwalkers. He's an outdoor person. He knows that, that we're interested in the work he does as it affects the lands that we bushwalk in and that we value. Anyway, sit back and relax. We're going to go for a wonderful journey through this wonderful land of ours with a wonderful man. Over to you, David.
Hi. So I'm David Bowman, and I'm going to have a bit of a chat, talk about fire. And I thought I would actually start really at a concept that came to me later in my career, and I very much saw this as the circle closing. And the concept is what you do if you're doing field work is often ecologists do something which is very abstract, and they put down an imaginary square and they call that the quadrat. And they might make measurements in this imaginary square. And after a while, if you spend a lot of time in the bush, as I have, you realize how absurd that is, because that's not the bush. It's an imaginary square. And you're putting that imaginary square down because you're trying to focus your mind. But the danger of that is you're actually not seeing the whole. You're just seeing an imaginary square. And later in life, I don't know whether somebody said it to me, but it was such an epiphany. They said, let's do a field traverse. And so doing field work, I'm a field scientist, you do this field traverse and you start walking through country. And suddenly you go, well, actually, this is what I started doing when I was 14. It's called bushwalking. What a very strange sort of realization. A lot of bushwalkers don't realize that they actually have the box seat to understanding landscape ecology. And the real tragedy in many ways is that the people who've got the opportunity and the training and the access to the knowledge of how ecological systems work, how landscapes work, actually don't do bushwalking. They actually are some of the least field-orientated people you'd know. They're very clever people. They're very good with computers. They're very good at playing the game and climbing the greasy pole and academic one-upmanship and all of that stuff. But they don't actually get it. They don't see the whole. They just see the imaginary square or the grant proposal or the scientific paper. They don't actually see the whole shooting match. And I think that I've been really lucky because I started as a bushwalker, and through my life, the intensity of the amount of adventures I've had in nature, whether it's bushwalking or rock climbing, whitewater kayaking or sea kayaking, all of those things are actually in the back of my mind field traverses. That's actually what I'm doing. I'm wanting to understand landscapes and wanting to understand how they work. And that's what really motivates me. It's the field traverse. So it's sort of ironic, yeah, bushwalking's a recreation, but actually it's something more than that. And I think a lot of people who've spent time traversing country, as we would say another way, or in Aboriginal English, we would say foot walking, which is sort of a weird Aboriginal expression. Foot walking, how else can you walk? Maybe you can walk with a horse, I don't know, but foot walking is the other way, Aboriginal way of saying a field traverse or bushwalking. And it's that engagement with nature and seeing patterns and seeing the diversity. So I think that's something which is really important to me, that I'm very strongly field orientated. And the second thing, which sort of comes back to the arc of my life, is that being a late baby boomer, actually, I'm really an Anthropocene. Anybody who has been, particularly born in the 1950s, is what we would describe as being born into a period in Earth history which is called the Great Acceleration. And that's when the Earth system became, or started to become, very strongly perturbed by anthropogenic influences. And that idea of strong anthropogenic influences has been apprehended in a word which you would have heard, because Missy Higgins has had a song, there's been books, there's been plays. So it's a great word. It's from actually a Nobel Prize winning chemist, the guy who helped find the hole in the ozone layer, Paul Crutzen. And Paul Crutzen apparently at one point in some scientific meeting where they were discussing anthropogenic effects on the Earth system, and particularly the conduit into that is through biogeochemistry or atmospheric chemistry. He apprehended this and he said, he coined the term, the Anthropocene. We're in the Anthropocene. So, well, what's the Anthropocene? And then Will Steffen, who has contributed to this, is the idea of the Great Acceleration, because the question is, well, what the Anthropocene is the imprint of humans into the Earth system. And then the question is, well, when did that begin? And the first approximation was, well, probably James Watt and the steam engine. But you could possibly argue it was the development of rice agriculture and the release of methane. There was some event, or the clearing of forests for agriculture, or you could say the detonation of atomic weapons in the 1950s, atmospheric tests, which have definitely left a signature across the planet. In fact, I've used it. It's called the bomb spike, where there was so much injected additional carbon-14 put into the atmosphere that plants, and indeed my body and probably your bodies, absorb that radioactive carbon. And at that year, the peak year of 1964 in the Southern Hemisphere, there's actually an anomaly of the amount of radioactivity, carbon-14, and also other isotopes. So the idea is that we're in this period in Earth history of change, and we know it's happened, certainly coincidental with colonization, coincidental with industrialization, it's coincidental with the end of the Second World War, with what's called the Great Acceleration, which was the baby boom, the post-war prosperity, which actually also cut into nature very hard, because the whole ethos of the post-war boom was to actually exploit natural resources. And the amount and the rate of change which occurred happened in post-war. But ironically, or maybe predictably, depending which way you want to look at it, that also meant that the beneficiaries of this prosperity were able to start exploring nature. And that's actually where the friction conservation movement became, that people before their own eyes were seeing very rapid change in environments, in landscapes, and that's really begot, certainly in Australia, the conservation movement. Things like Lake Pedder, why are you destroying Lake Pedder? Why? Why? Asking a really interesting and simple question, that how could something of such beauty being destroyed for the purposes of hydro-industrialisation? And in a sense, both of those propositions, the destruction of Lake Pedder and hydro-industrialisation and the innate beauty of Lake Pedder, were both self-evident, but they were just opposite. And that created the great tumult where, and injected and turbocharged not only the enjoyment of nature, but also the development of national parks, nature-based tourism that we're now in. So is that, I think that what I'm saying is that what happened in the like I would say maybe the Great Acceleration, the early part of the Great Acceleration, is that we were able to see the world change before us, and there were consequences. Well, guess what? Those changes that were happening, some of the bigger ones were embodied, but they were invisible. They were embodied, but they were invisible. They were known, they were not unknown in any, you couldn't say they were unknown unknowns. They were certainly, there were unknown properties of known. They were known. They were known, but they were invisible. What do I mean by that? And what I would argue is just in the same way as the revealing of, why are they destroying Lake Pedder? How could anybody in their right mind want to put a quarry right on top of the hazards in Freycinet? I mean, if you suggested that now, just imagine just how mad you would be thought. I want to quarry the hazards. I want to quarry the hazards, right? Just imagine somebody saying that. That's an impossible thought. Everybody knows that Coles Bay Freycinet National Park is of unspeakable special beauty. But guess what? In the 1970s, somebody did want to quarry the hazards. They wanted to put a thumping great quarry, would have been in direct line of sight. They did quarry part of the hazards, I might add, down at sea level. You can see the remains of that quarry, but right on the core, we could have done that. And we did do some stupid things, but we had an awareness. But when I said there was something else, invisible but relentless, invisible but relentless, what am I talking about? This invisible but relentless thing, which has not expressed itself until recently. What am I talking about? I'm talking about anthropogenic climate change. That's what I'm talking about. That if you look at the Keeling curve, and I don't know whether you know what the Keeling curve is, the Keeling curve has two remarkable properties. The Keeling curve was set up by a guy called Keeling, and he persuaded, whether it was the Department of the Navy or the Department of Energy, I don't know, but in the 1950s, he persuaded the Americans, the American federal government, to establish an observatory on Muir Loa, the large volcano on the big island of Hawaii, to track CO2, because there was a strong hypothesis that CO2 concentrations were going to track the Great Acceleration. And we should be grateful for the Keeling curve, because that's exactly what it does. It's a relentless up, 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 up. But it's also got another beauty, and that is that you can actually see the respiration of the planet, if you will. That every year there's this beautiful cycle, and that's the cycle of the flush of the growth of the forests in the Northern Hemisphere, and then the fall and the quiescence of the forests for the winter. So you have the drawdown from the growth, and then the decomposition and the release. And you have this beautiful cycle, this curve going up and up and up and up. When I first became acquainted to the Keeling curve, it was like, oh, I don't know. It might have been 360, and the beginning of the Industrial Revolution was 280. So, you know, that was, you know, significant, but not awesome. And when I was at Harvard, they were doing experiments where they were looking at a doubling of pre-industrial CO2, which seemed like, you know, a lifetime away, and what that would do to plants and plant growth, and very fascinating. Plants are so responsive to CO2. So this curve has just been quietly going up and up and up and up and up and up and up. And only a few years ago, we crossed 400 ppm. I mean, we should have been bare knuckle terror that we were crossing 400 ppm of CO2, because that's a long way from 280. That's a long way. And to consider during the Ice Age, it was 180. So we're really messing with the Earth system here. But it was invisible. The effect of this was really quite invisible until recently, where we're now beginning to see a real effect of climate change. Now, the irony with climate change effects is that a lot of people assumed that it was a thermostat, including a lot of biologists. And so they would look at a mountainside, you all know the tree line, or you all know the snow gum line. And so you would go, oh, well, let's add, you know, another degree of warming, and you could imagine the tree line moving up the mountain, just that little bit. And so there was a whole cottage industry in what were called species distribution modeling, where you would take the known range of a plant or an animal, and then you would add in, you know, what we would expect of climate change. And you'd say, oh, look, you know, the animal or the plant will move across the landscape in some way. So we you know, we convinced ourselves, I think, that this was a really useful thing to do. And you say, oh, look how nature will adjust and the tree line will go up the mountain. Pity about the pencil pines, because they're going to run out of mountain to go up. But it was basically, it was a sort of a system that which was sort of comprehensible to our minds. But guess what? Nature doesn't work like that. Nature doesn't work like that at all. The idea that you're going to have this gradualism, suddenly we got smacked in the face, where the gradualism was replaced by very abrupt and rapid changes, spasms, if you like, Earth system spasms. And what we're now seeing is the ultimate Earth system spasm, which is the Black Summer fires. The Black Summer fires we've just experienced, something around, you know, there's still an argument, something around 10 million hectares of eucalypt forest were burnt this last summer. And that fire event was extraordinary. You know, a lot of, you know, the climate skeptics say, oh, but there's been large fires before in Australia. Absolutely, there's been large fires, but just never in a eucalypt forest, not like that. But the thing about that fire was that it was not only so huge, it actually also burnt the critical carbon stocks of our landscape, the forests. And some recent work by the Australian government have actually calculated that the emissions from the Black Summer fires, the emissions, the CO2 emissions, would make those fire grounds dominant in New South Wales, some in Queensland, and a sizable but small fraction in Victoria. And maybe we could throw in Kangaroo Island, but that's really just, you know, small change. But those fire grounds would make, those fire grounds, if they were a nation, would be the 6th largest greenhouse gas emitters of all of the nations. So, you know, exceeded by China and America and Japan and Germany, so on. But this fire event was actually a gigantic CO2 emission. There are a couple of other really weird properties about this fire event. So there's an atmospheric phenomenon called pyrocumulonimbus. So cumulonimbus you would have heard of, these towering thunderstorms. Well, pyrocumulonimbus is a fire-driven thunderstorm. And I've had the fortune of studying the only known pyrocumulonimbus in Tasmania, which developed above the Dunalley fire in the 4th of January 2013. And that event, because we had a weather radar on the Tasman Peninsula which were observing it, that event saw a standard bushfire with a smoke plume of about 3 kilometres rapidly, explosively escalate to punch up into the stratosphere and to go 15 kilometres into the stratosphere. And they are genuinely small atomic explosions. That's the intensity of these events. Now, these are very, very unusual events. In California, there's documented creation of tornadoes which come off the side of them. They create lightning, and of course that starts more fires. They create black hail, they create black rain. They do really seriously weird things. Well, these are what were called black swan events, so a very, very unusual event. So this last summer, there were 35 pyrocumulonimbus came out of those fire grounds, which is, in one fire season, to have 35 pyrocumulonimbus would be, it's so absurdly improbable. We're talking about it would be more likely that the Earth would be hit by, a giant asteroid than that, by random chance. But of course, it's not a random chance event. It's actually the relentless consequence of the Great Acceleration and that relentless CO2 emissions that are going up, up and up. And now what we're seeing are the biospheric feedbacks, where the carbon stores of the forests are now becoming, which were, sinks, are now becoming sources, which means that our CO2 emissions are likely to accelerate and climate change is likely to accelerate. So what are the consequences for somebody like me, my lived experience? So I started bushwalking in the Australian Alps, and I have such intense and fond memories of a boy, teenager, bushwalking in the Australian Alps. And last year I drove across the Australian Alps. I'd been kayaking on the Midda, and I drove across the Australian Alps over Mount Hotham down, and the place was just a desiccated coconut. It was just I went over Dinner Plain, which I remember there was no road, no development, no airstrip, no nothing. I remember Dinner Plain Hut so clearly back in the 1970s. And there was water, and you would go into the forests in summer, and there was, just as likely you could catch a blizzard. You could get hypothermia. The only thing you could get now in the Australian Alps in summer is sunstroke and dehydration. In other words, in my lived experience, the places that I've known have changed. And with the Australian Alps particularly, pretty well all of the Australian Alps have now been burnt at least once, many places several times, which have had very dramatic effects on, I was talking about tree lines and saying, it's just this reliable, incremental change, as you warm the planet, the snow gums would gradually inch their way up and invade the alpine vegetation. No, that doesn't work like that. What ends up happening is that all of the snow gums get incinerated. They're so drought stressed that they feebly resprout from their giant mallee roots. And remembering, most of the snow gum forests that we've experienced since post-war were all regrowth from the 1939 fires. So all of those snow gum forests, they used to be giant, umbrageous, beautiful forests. They're a little bit of the old growth is less, but most of that old growth has been blown away, 03, 07, 09, 13, so on and so on, right up to this summer. The fires in Kosciuszko are just simply mind-bending that, we're seeing these recurrent sort of layering upon layering because of layering of these fires, and then we're seeing very dramatic landscape change. We're seeing change in the distributional patterns. So that's going to change. You know, when I look in Tassie, I've done a lot of bushwalking in Tassie. Of course, you know, 2016, it was very close to getting the walls of Jerusalem, very close to getting Mount Anne. In the early part of 2019, it's hard to believe in the same year that the Tasmanian 2019 fires have been forgotten already, but when they were occurring, they were just extraordinary. They were so large, they were lightning ignited, they were threatening Mount Anne, they burnt right down across the Arthur Plains, down the Huon, all the way pretty well down to the outskirts of Huonville. The whole of the Huon Valley got burnt. Not necessarily catastrophically for the old growth, but it certainly got burnt. So there's many places that I've been, since I've been back in Tassie from the Northern Territory, that it's kind of weird. Like, you know, I kayak in some of these places now, they've been burnt, you know, and not just a few of them. Many of these places have been burnt. It's like just watching the dominoes falling. So when the first large fire occurred on the same day as Dunalley, which was out in the near Port Davey, it's called the Giblin River Fire, burnt down through the Davey Gorge. I went out there with a mate, not funded by the government. I actually got a fisherman, a mate I knew who had a fishing boat. We put our sea kayaks. We went around to Port Davey and we paddled up into the Davey Gorge, and then we walked up to the crossing river. And I could not believe what I was seeing. I was seeing a Southwest Tasmania that just completely blew my circuits, because I'd spent a lot of time in Southwest Tassie, and back in, you know, when I lived in Tassie earlier in the 1970s, 1980s, you know, the signature tune of Southwest Tasmania was wet. It was just wet, you know, and the bushwalking was actually sort of, you know, basically Russian roulette, because the weather forecasts were pretty crude in those days. And more, you know, the number of times, you know, you had epic trips with flooded rivers and, you know, incredible, you know, like, you know, ridiculous, like why we didn't die. Yeah, we went to Federation one time and, you know, we were clambering around, water going, you know, down through our Japara jackets and, you know, trying to do this ridiculous traverse and, you know, camping in a bog and fighting our way down Moss Ridge, you know, to a gigantic and terrifyingly flooded Craycross River and so on. You know, these were just like, this was just what it was, you know, that's what Tasmanian bushwalking was in those days. Now, it's actually all different. It's sure you still get floods, but you get flash floods. It's basically drying up. And we've recently done work on the peat landscapes. Critical threshold for the combustion of the peat landscapes is that we're now seeing that pretty well every summer, the soils are dropping down to become combustible. So what that means, and what we saw when I went in 2013, is that we're going to see a lot more of the organic soils burn away. And the loss of those organic soils is going to completely transform Southwest Tasmania. And as I say, the dominant hue, you know, the old, in my memory, you know, was sort of these dull, dun greens and grey and wet, you know, and yellow and very dank. And soon the signature tune is going to, all of the black peat is going to be burnt off, or at least it'll be piebald, it'll be burnt off in certainly the more exposed areas. So we're going to see these great changes. It's going to make walking a lot easier because it'll be very open. It'll be open heathland. You know, it's going to be beautiful. Don't get me wrong. It's just going to be very, very different. Just in the same way that the Australian Alps are becoming very, very different. The snow lie is changing. You've only got to ask the skiing industry. Eventually, those ski resorts will be burnt down anyway, or they'll go broke trying to, you know, create artificial snow because of the energy costs and the difficulties of sourcing the water. So we're gradually seeing, as the sort of Anthropocenians, as I said, that, you know, the beginning of our environmental consciousness, or certainly my beginning of the environmental consciousness, was seeing the collision of development with the beautiful natural landscapes. And now at the end of the sort of the arc of my life, and I'm talking about my life, is that what I'm now seeing is not so much the threat of development to these landscapes, but the threat of climate change on these landscapes, particularly being expressed through these very large-scale megafires, repeated burning, which is changing the character, the quality, the biodiversity, but also, and the integrity, but also the practicality of even being in these environments, that the summertime is just not a time to be above the tree line now on the mainland of Australia. That's just not a good idea, you know. And that's why I suggested earlier this year, is you start putting 2 and 2 together. And this, of course, was pre-COVID, which is, again, just frankly, just an expression of the Anthropocene. It's not really anything unexpected. If you have high densities of human beings and you, if you, as a geographer would say, obliterate space, because there was a moment in geography where, you know, certain social geographers are saying, you know, just the same as the end of history, there was the claim that space had been conquered by humans. There was no space, there was just globalization. You could, you know, go anywhere and it would be pretty much the same, and you could do it cheaply, and you could actually organize your business and your recreation, and everything could be just this gigantic fluid of people moving all around the globe with no boundaries. But of course, in exactly the same way as climate change, a little teeny virus, and if you put all of the virus particles into a vial and weighed them, they probably don't even weigh a gram. A little teeny virus just suddenly went boom. Sorry, humans, you're really going to have to get to know your place again, because this endless travel and globalization doesn't work biologically, because you're a sitting duck for these diseases. And if we get a vaccine for COVID, there's going to be more. There's going to be more of these diseases, because it's an inevitability of high densities of one organism. You know, super high densities if you could factor in all of the travel. And that's exactly the same with climate change, that we've changed our reality, and now we're going back to how the hell are we going to dig our way out of this? And I don't know how much more time I've got to speak, but the solutions to this problem are actually place-based solutions, and they're community-based solutions. And they're really about understanding country, and they're really understanding how that we can harmonize fire and adapt and heroically try to make the remaining pieces of biodiversity and the unburnt vegetation. We're really going to have to put a lot of effort into protecting these things, not just dumping fire retardant on Wollemi pines. It's going to be a lot more clever than that. There's going to be a lot more energy of, you know, how are we going to, basically, we've got a husbanding program and what I call renewal ecology. And that those field traverses, you know, where are the younger generation? How can we get the younger generation to understand the values of the landscapes? We need, I believe, although it's, you know, prizing them away from the devices, we need to take them into the field and give them field traverses. And that's actually a thinly disguised way of saying, you know, legitimize bushwalking. Need to actually just take people into nature. Nature is an incredibly great conversationist. If you go into nature, the thing I always find about nature is that exactly as an Aboriginal people say, you're talking to country, or country talks to you. That if you can calm people down, you know, have a cup of tea and sit there, country will ask you all these amazing questions about yourself, where you're from, how you feel about this place, you know, what do you think about this? Where's the water? Where's the firewood? Where's the danger? And then, you know, you start seeing more and more things. you actually, you know, that's why we love bushwalking, because you're actually involved in a conversation with landscape. So I think that's probably enough, but I can keep going if you like.
Oh, look, thank you so much, David. That was wonderful. You almost caught me on the hop there. I was just immersed in listening to you. You're quite right. You could keep going. And I'm sure I'd be in good company with the audience, just enjoying, well, enjoying is possibly not quite the right word. You know, captivated by your narrative. I mean, you've covered so much ground there. I know we've had some questions coming in from some of our members, and I think David will have a few more there. But just before we go to those ones, you've covered a lot of ground, but one of the things that right at the end you struck me, you're talking about the younger generation. Of course, we see with some of the climate activist groups a sort of a rhetoric which is, you know, probably about time, saying it's our future, what are you oldies doing? And I say that in the context of most bushwalking clubs tending to be a bunch of older people. And you're dipping into the bushwalking as the land traverse, which is a lovely way to think of it. But I suppose from our point of view as a bushwalking association, you know, is there a role for us in some way to be engaging a younger generation, perhaps about the issues you're talking about, rather than about just getting them involved in bushwalking? Have you seen examples of, for example, of getting a younger generation engaged, perhaps in ways that we as an older generation might not do?
It's something that, you know, bothers me a lot, that the privilege and the opportunity and the encouragement, but also the amazing freedom that I had, you know, allowing yourself to get lost and finding yourself, and, you know, and doing all sorts of, you know, like, it's just, that would be regulated out of existence, the stuff we did. And, you know, it was exciting and tough. I certainly notice with my students, I realised that actually it's only a rare few, that there are, you know, at universities, there are groups of young people who are having tremendous adventures and in their way, interpreting in their generational way. But many of them are so deconnected, decoupled, de-skilled, you know, that I've actually argued at my university, because of course universities are changing, but one of the, you know, because there's all of these safety concerns. And I said, you know, really for PhD students, what we should be doing is, you know, having like, you know, coursework, and some of the coursework should be field skills, how to put up a tent, how to actually function in the bush. Because a lot of these people who are going to go on to be ecologists or field researchers actually have they've got no ability, you know, let alone how to drive four-wheel drive or get out of a bog or, you know, all of those things. They just don't have any smarts, you know, they just missed so much. And I don't know how to remedy that, because it's sort of a real gap, that if you're always been in busy places and the only experience you've had of national parks is around the honeypots, how you can get people to have that sort of that moment where the bend in the river, or shadow, or they see that mushroom, they see that rock, and that's the thing that they're going to go, oh, this is just extraordinarily beautiful and complex and you know, and deep and profound. I don't know how I don't know, you know, I wrote an article, you know, for Conversation a while ago, about, you know, could our national parks become empty churches? You know, and there's a real danger that if we don't think about that generational process, and how to inspire or connect people, and they may, how we do that. That's why I'm not, I can't get, super worked up about, like huts in national parks, but like the Overland Track private national park thing, or some of the walks. Commercialising national parks is kind of weird, but the other side of it is at least it's developing some sort of constituency. Often the sorts of people who are doing those trips are maybe more cashed up, but how do we get the younger ones into these experiences? I don't know, and how relatedly we have to provide, because some of the things I've said are very gloomy, we have to provide also a sense of hope and purpose, that it's not, so we've got to be careful about nostalgia and, like, yeah, you can go do the Western Arthurs, but, it's nothing like what I did when I did it in the 1970s. That was awesome. Now it's, a cakewalk, whatever, it doesn't, you don't need to, we need some way of, I don't know what the answer is. We need a way of fostering that connection, because through that connection is going to be the key to the adaptation step. And that's where I think just going back more to just local scale is really important. I think community groups that are, doing restoration projects, which are a sort of a slight, they're a little bit different to bushwalking, but there's a community group where I live in West Hobart, and they've done wonderful things. They've got all these beautiful little trails, and I walk around those trails all the time, and just being repeatedly walking around the same patch of bush, not necessarily exploring, but just going around like I try to get there when I'm in Hobart every day, just to see what's changed, and to see just going through a week and then into a month and then the seasonal cycle and just the changing sun angles and the changing phenology of the plants. Those things are really tremendous too. So just validating access, even if they're little things, just validating that, I think, is a way of encouraging people to love nature.
That's fascinating listening. I had a sense from you that part of your driver was that sort of a deep sense of belonging from your early youth and sort of a sense of identity. And again, I suppose from what you're saying, perhaps what we're searching for in this contemporary world is how to create a sense of identity amongst younger people that touches on all of this. We've got lots of questions. I see David working away, but I did wonder, in fact, and this may for some of the others sound like a slightly esoteric question, but I'm just wondering whether this is a problem of science, that science has become so important that we've lost the art of being in country, and whether there's something that we as people who probably experience the bush in the ways that you're talking about, in an emotive and sensuous way, as well as a knowledgeable way, have got to try and somehow encourage others to say, look, it's quite okay to go out there and just be in awe of the sunlight. And
yeah, that's right. I mean, one of the things about academic ecology is, it is tinged with the idea of, the search for the universal, because science is a universalist project, and a hydrogen, atom is a hydrogen atom wherever you are. So, and astronomers can detect these elements and so on. But with nature, there's only one Earth, and there's only one place where life exists, as far as we know. And we're the only living, intelligent beings who've been able to manipulate an Earth system, as far as we know. So this is all fairly new and major stuff. And I think that the danger with the science training is that that's why I was talking about the imaginary squares, that I remember, I remember doing, and behind me is a feature in Arnhem Land. I've spent a lot of time in Arnhem Land, a lot of time with Aboriginal people studying Aboriginal fire use. And I remember there I was with an imaginary square, you know, clipping stuff and weighing it and being a scientist. And I had Aboriginal people with me. They're worried because I was in their country. And they were, you know, they're just like, wow, this is just kind of really weird, you know. And I was aware that it was just me and them, you know, and I was kind of aware that it was really weird. And then I thought, okay, I can't keep doing this. Well, there were two things. In the short term, I put everything down and I said, look, you got to understand, I'm a white fella and this is my ceremony. And I got to do my ceremony right. And if I don't do my ceremony right, I'm going to get sick. So this is what I'm doing. I've got to do this business. Now, that is probably a good way to explain it, because for an Aboriginal person, you have responsibility and duty, and you have a ceremony. And if you don't follow your law, then you can get sick. You create social problems, but you create problems for your spiritual, mental, and physical health. And exactly the same way the scientists, because the scientists, it's all bullshit anyway. You can make up numbers. Probably scientists do, you know. The only thing stopping you from making up numbers is that you believe in your ceremony. You believe deeply that it's important that you don't delete that outlier to make your statistics better, or you don't, you know, just make up data, or you don't, you know, I mean, there are unethical people, but really the number of watchdogs relative to the opportunity to be unprofessional, it's got to be internalized. You've got to have that love of it. But that love or sense of that ceremony can be actually excluding too, and it can also be distorting. And that's when the second thing I did with the Aboriginal folk is that they wanted to take me buffalo hunting. So, you know, I'd end work early and then we'd just go buffalo hunting and do what they wanted to do. They showed me their reality. And I can assure you, you know, buffalo hunting is like, it's pretty amazing. You know, there's whitewater kayaking, there's buffalo hunting. It's pretty exciting and pretty crazy. And it's what they did, you know, and it's like what a young Aboriginal man could do. It's incredible, an incredible way of engaging with nature. And interestingly, the buffalo, I might add, which are an exotic species from the Aborigines, they were already incorporated into their cosmology, that they were part of the rainbow serpent, the destructive side of the rainbow serpent. So, you know, what I learned from all of those things is step out of the imaginary square, the quadrat, and actually step back in. But it was very easy for me because I was going back to where I started. I only got into science because I love nature, and I was just going, in a sense, to be more, you know, then I would do research projects where I'd say, well, we're going to do some field traverses, which is otherwise known as bushwalking, you know, and I would demand that people, you know, oh, you just got to come, because that's how, and, you know, I do recreate, but really I'm not recreating. I'm, you know, when I go down a river or go walking, I'm involved in my craft as well. So how we encourage that curiosity and that love, you know, bushwalking could be seen as just sort of, you know, a form of, you know, like road running or something. It's way, way more than that. This is way, 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 way more than that. And then you're exactly right, Bill. It's a conduit, particularly for settler Australians, to try to work out place, you know, understand place, and to understand country, and to understand responsibility to country. And, you know, all of those things become hugely important, but there might reach a point in your life where you don't need to go exploring anymore. You can just walk around one place and just go I'm on Bruny Island now. I spend a lot of time on Bruny Island, and I'm just so in love with Bruny Island. You know, it's just just every day I'm just, getting a buzz from being here. There's so much to see and do and learn just by walking around. So I don't know. I mean, I'm very lucky. I don't know how we inspire the younger generation. I don't know how we get people to step out of their square. That's what we need to do, stepping out of that square into that environment, because then they can reimagine everything.
Yeah. Oh, that's wonderful. I think you're spot on in terms of, that characterization of bushwalking. It's far more than just going for a walk. And I suspect that most bushwalkers get it. Maybe it's a communication of how we pass that on to others and say, this is not just about going for a walk. I mean, I'm sure everybody in the audience will know of talks and discussions as you walk. There was, in fact, a quote from, I think, the early days of the Sydney Bushwalkers, of one of the presidents saying that a bushwalk without a conversation is not a bushwalk. He says there's no point in going for a bushwalk in silence. You've got to be communing. And I think that communion is something that bushwalkers get, and perhaps it's something that we need to find ways of expressing more widely. Look, I've got lots of questions, but I'm going to pass over to David. You've got some audience questions? You've been sort of keeping an eye on the chat. Is there?
Yeah, there actually are a lot of questions, and I don't think we're going to get through all of them. No. So what I was going to ask Kirsten, can we email these questions down to David, the ones we can't get through, and if David could kindly provide a response, then we can email them out to everyone. Is that possible, Kirsten?
Yeah, but it might be not possible for me, given.
Oh, okay. Okay.
It'd be easier to just. I'm really, really busy. I'm writing.
All right.
Okay. So, yeah, I'm behind with so much that.
All right. Let's start anyway, and we'll see how we go. The first one is actually really easy. It's from Paula, and she wants to know where the beautiful spot is in your background photo.
This is a place called Dugalajaran, which is on the Cadell River, which is about 100 kilometres south of Maningrida. And it's a spectacularly beautiful place, and I've been privileged to be able to camp there. And I've become very close with an Aboriginal family that lives in an outstation nearby called Kolabadada. My kids have basically grown up with Aboriginal families' kids, so yeah, it's one of my special places in the world, I suppose.
Okay. Look, a number of the questions are on similar themes, so I'm going to kind of roll them up into one question. So apologies ahead if I have not captured everything, but there's a couple of questions around community and community-based strategies for dealing with fires. And so there's one question about the need, you mentioned the need about community-based strategies for fire management, and can you elaborate on this? But there's also a very specific question from a group, Friends of Malabar Headland, which is a location in Sydney's eastern suburbs, and they've currently got a bit of a problem with national parks about a proposed burn, hazard reduction burn, and I think they have very different opinions to national parks about how this should be undertaken and so forth. And there's actually a critically endangered ecological community that's affected. So their question is, so we've got the question about involving community in fire management, but there's also this question about how can they work with national parks to change their national parks approach, or should they just accept what national parks are putting up? So I guess the theme of the question is, how can communities have some influence about what the authorities are doing in relation to fire management?
Right. Well, that's absolutely the key question. And I've been privileged to be contributing to the inquiry, New South Wales bushfire inquiry, and one of the points I've been emphasising is that community is really a key here, and we've got to be careful that we don't fall into the trap of top-down command and control, pushing solutions down, because you end up what I would call end up in a bizarre double bind. And a double bind is when you tell people two contradictory things and they don't know how to respond to them. You have somebody shouting at you, "I love you." You know, it's kind of weird. So what happens with a lot of management agencies is that they're saying two things at once. One is communities have got to take responsibility, but the other is we're going to do all of these great things for you and you have no input. And, you know, obviously that's self-cancelling. It doesn't work. You end up alienating the people who really are the key to solving the problem. So I believe very strongly in community-based solutions and forming groups of people, but not, this is the gear change which is required, not the old school adversarial, you know, and I went through the Franklin, the whole thing, you know, I understand that sort of, you know, the classic environmentalist tactics, which, you know, can be very effective, but they're also very divisive. And something like fire, you know, it's not like a campaign and a win and lose. Fire is something that is an ongoing issue. And because of climate change, it's an ongoing and evolving issue. So even if we've got the best solution today, and we can all agree on it, that best solution in 5 years' time is probably not going to work anymore because of the rate of climate change. So the escalating risk. So you need to be able to work with these agencies, but then the key point with particularly with prescribed burning is you actually have to ask a different question. And a lot of people get stuck on prescribed burning. It's a binary. It's either prescribed burning or not prescribed burning. And a lot of the fire managers are very in love with prescribed burning. They think prescribed burning is awesome. They've got, you know, they're very proud that they can do it. What you got to, the way I explain it's like this: you say, let's imagine that you can build a house with a hammer. You know, hammers are really important because you're building a house with a hammer. But let's imagine that you're building a new sort of house with a spanner and there are no hammers involved, just spanners. And you can assemble a house. Now, in both cases, you get a house, right? And we want a house, but we use different tools. So then let's imagine that we have a big fight about tools. Hammers are better than spanners. No, that's wrong. No, spanners are much better. So that's what happens with prescribed burning, that people are arguing about the method, but they're not actually thinking about the outcome. And you've got to go back. The point of engagement with an agency is not the method. It's saying, what are you trying to do here? What is this that you're trying to do? Are you telling me that you can only do this by doing your prescribed burning? Are you certain there's not an alternative? Because that's actually a better way to start the conversation. You're saying, I just need to know, let's think creatively, is there another way we can do this? Could we, you know, get brush cutters? Could we do thinning? Could we do something? You know, animals, is there something we can do that could avoid these prescribed burns? Or do these prescribed burns have to be in these big blocks? Could they be done in little tiny micro patches? Those sorts of conversations, I think, would then reveal that the managers aren't necessarily certain either. And through that, if there is genuine goodwill, you may actually hit upon some new approach, which could actually be better because, you know, oh, we're not going to use burning, we're going to use slashing. Awesome, no smoke. You know, awesome, we can do it in winter, we can do it in summer, we can do it whenever we like, you know. Whereas if you're stuck with prescribed burning, stuck with it has to be like this because it's only practical if it's like this. And then, you know, they make up all these reasons. So I think that, you know, it's really, I'm answering two things, that the community group is really the key. And I believe one of the emergent things that's going to come from the bushfire crisis will be a much greater valuing of community groups. And a lot of community groups, you know, rather than sitting around and waiting for the government to organise a community group, organise a community group, because you'd be surprised that a lot of the agencies would probably be relieved if a community group saying, we're a community group, we really want to be engaged in fuel management and we want to work with you, but, you know, we've got to have a conversation here. You can't just shut us down. So rather than just, you know, an adversarial pushing it, because the agencies love that, you know, it just feeds their monster, you know, that, oh, you know, we've got an enemy, you know, our budget needs to be bigger or this, or, you know, let's write another ministerial. Whereas you're actually trying to cut away from that and say, you know, we're really wanting houses built, and we have to be honest that there are lots of different tools to do that.
Yeah. That's actually answered a couple of questions in one go. That's great. I'm going to move on. You mentioned also during your presentation about First Nations people and what we can learn from them in terms of fire management. Someone's made an interesting comment that they think, obviously we perhaps have a slightly simplistic view about how First Nations people, you know, burn their country. And this comment was suggesting that it's likely that First Nations people change their management practices with climate change over the many years and constant learning about the landscape as it changed. So do you think we need to be, I guess a question here is, do you think we need to be slightly, we need to be less simplistic about how Aborigines managed fire and be willing to adopt a range of ideas that may be appropriate for different parts of the continent?
So when I was 17, I came to Tassie and I did a little course. They had an idea of, you know, having bushwalkers going into Southwest Tassie. It was a great idea, and that trained people to be like remote area firefighters, never went anywhere. In that course, I got exposed to fire stick farming idea, you know, the idea of fire stick farming. And this was back in, you know, 1975. And that idea sort of stalked me, and that's why I went to Arnhem Land. I wanted to learn about traditional Aboriginal fire use. But whilst that's been happening, there's been a movement which you may have heard of called cultural burning, and Aboriginal people down south have become more prominent and more persuasive, saying, well, hang on, you know, we've got a stake in fire management. And so it's been really interesting for me because I've seen, you know, my own life journey and my awareness, having the opportunity to work with traditional people. But when I came back to Tassie, I've made contact and worked with the Tasmanian Aboriginal community. And out of that, I see that there are what I see as two sort of related strands. One is traditional Aboriginal burning and the other is cultural burning. And the distinction is, one is, you know, the ancestral practice on the ancestral land, an unbroken tradition, very rare. And the other is a rekindling, a restoration, a renewal of cultural practice. Now, in most of the environments down south, the renewal is happening in heavily disturbed environments, plus climate change. And I actually don't see that as a problem. You know, again, it's like, you know, this connoisseurship, you know, oh, but that's not authentic, you know, like, you know, that's not who cares? What's authentic? You know, what is this? You know, it's all like, oh, it's not, you know, it's a forgery. It's like, no, it's just human beings being human beings. Human beings are adaptable. And original person, you've had your culture really messed up by colonization, then of course you're going to have to renew things. But having worked with the Tasmanian Aborigines, we did a restoration project in the Midlands of Tasmania, how proud they were, how important it was to their identity and to their self, to their sense of self, that you know, it's just a ridiculous idea to say, well, that's not authentic Tasmanian Aboriginal burning. It's like there isn't any authentic Tasmanian Aboriginal burning. We are all in the process of adapting. And where I see a real opportunity with cultural burning is that if we can have good relations with Aboriginal communities and respect them, and ideally we need to have an affirmative action program to help them overcome the social and historical disadvantage and injustices, to have a role and a place in fire management, we could end up with this really great outcome, in theory, with community groups that are looking after country in tandem with Aboriginal people, working together as a group, not in a divisive way, but together, and slowly convincing each other that what we're doing is Aboriginal fire management. We don't have to say it's it's the authentic original fire management, and it's quite ridiculous to care about that, because fire management needs to change because of climate change, weeds, feral animals, urbanisation, and so on. But going back to the prescribed burning, the really cool thing about cultural burning and the difference, the distinction, cultural burning, and I recommend Victor Steffofferson's little book. It's a great sort of conduit into cultural burning, but and there's some really great resources on the web. The thing about Aboriginal or Indigenous burning is it's like slow cooking. It's incredibly small scale, it's sensitive, and the central premise is sense of place and value of place, not industrial fuel management, not compliance and let's process this landscape as fast as humanly possible with a view to, doing it as cheaply as possible. It's quite a different thing. Now, community groups can push back against, we've got a deal for you, we're going to come and process your landscape. Because almost certainly you're going to get a McDonald's product, and you're alienating people, and it's not healthy. So I think that we've got this opportunity, even if it's make-believe, or it's a little bit make-believe, why not dive into it? A lot of the stuff we do and believe is all make-believe anyway. And after a couple of iterations, the make-believe becomes real.
Thanks, David, for that. You mentioned Steffenson's book. Actually, I'm glad you mentioned that, because it's actually in one of the questions that was submitted, a reference to that. Kirsten, how are we going with time? Because we've still got a lot of more questions here, but are we going to run out of time?
Yes, I'll leave it to you and Bill to manage the time. Our deadline, our meeting normally finishes at 9.
Yep.
Bill, what did you want to do?
I was just going to suggest we might do one more. I appreciate we've run over the original plan of having a meeting, but this is just so fascinating. I think the flow of questions in tells me the audience is captivated. I wonder if there's time for one more, and then I might just do a roundup. And
all right, I'm going to ask David quite a technical question now, and apologies for those who didn't get round to their questions, but there were a lot, and that's great to see. But anyway, someone's posed a question. Mike here has asked, what is the time lag involved between a major CO2 event, whether it's increase or decrease, and the observance of that change in atmospheric records, for example, in Hawaii?
So the question is the
time lag. Yeah.
Well, that's an extremely technical and complex question, and I could be interpreted in many ways. But one way to think about, say, the CO2 event that's just happened in the Black Summer fires is that in the government report, which is actually available on the web, the number of gigatons was something, I think, I can't remember, it was something like 930 gigatons. But then they said that was gross, but net, they were saying even now it had gone down to something like 870. So there was already drawdown. Now, one of the problems with fire emissions from CO2 is that it was an equilibrium argument, and that the view was that because the biosphere was sort of in equilibrium, the only source of CO2 from the biosphere was through deforestation, particularly tropical deforestation and land clearing. That's like really bad, you know, land clearing. Everything else was on balance, it was going to grow back. So what goes up comes down. But what we're now realizing is that as you stress the environment, the regrowth, the recovery becomes less likely, and you can wind up where the CO2 isn't going to be drawn down. So the half-life of CO2, which is another way of the question, you know, if we all stopped emissions that climate change is embodied for quite some time, I mean, at least I think it's up to somewhere between 50 to 100 years. But there are all sorts of complexities about that drawdown, how quickly the biosphere could pull that down. And I've asked one of the leading researchers in the world this question: if humans disappeared, how quickly would it take for the Earth system to restabilize? And it's like an unknown question of how the biosphere will respond. If it could ever re-equilibrate, we may have actually nudged the planet into, so if humans all died from the pandemic, say, that new equilibrium might not be pre-industrial, it could be an elevated amount. Who knows? And you've got to also remember that the CO2 concentrations in the Earth, you know, during the time when the world was ice-free, because, you know, that was in the, you know, about 40 million years ago, you know, when there was forests on Antarctica, the CO2 concentrations were, you know, well, you know, they're 400, they were 800 to 1,000 ppm. So they were much higher, but we had an ice-free world. So these are very complicated questions. If I could just give a plug for a really good film that's got some of these ideas, many of the ideas I've been talking about, a little bit strange because I was on a panel on Saturday with the filmmaker. I'd never met him, and I was obliged to watch his film. And it's called Wilder Than Wild. And it's really about the fire crisis in the Western US. And it covers off all of these issues: CO2, smoke, indigenous, community, prescribed burning, climate change, everything. So I'll send Kirsten the link to that film because I think you would really, if you've enjoyed me talking, that film is a really maybe way more coherent story where you can, you know, go through it and get a sense. The other thing is that I've written lots and lots of, well, obviously lots of scientific papers. I was going to say comma, unfortunately. But fortunately or unfortunately, I would not recommend any of you to try to read them. But I have written a fair bit for The Conversation, and The Conversation is a really good academic blog website, which is not just my work, but there's lots of stuff on bushfires, climate change, really good way to get educated, lots of smart, you know, academics contributing to that, and written to be accessible, and they're short, you know, it's like 700 words. So you can get, if you know, lots of stuff about prescribed burning, Aboriginal burning, climate change, fires, you name it. Everything I've covered is there. So you can actually do a little bit of your own research and just, you know, have a play, you know, use the search function on The Conversation. You'll find answers to probably any of the questions you were going to ask me that I couldn't answer. But I'll send you the link for the film because it's, I think, really, it would be really, if you are interested in this stuff, it's worth a look. I don't know about how you get access to it. I'll send Kirsten the details to the filmmaker. So that then you can, he's really into community groups and stuff. And hopefully, I don't know whether he charges, I have no idea how it works, but I'm certain that it would be reasonable.
Oh, look, David, that's, I think, a great place to end there. I've taken an indulgence of our members by allowing this discussion just to keep going rather than go to the business end of the meeting, which we normally have. And for those of you who are expecting a business meeting, I'll talk very briefly at the end. But before I do that, I noticed in the chat there's continuing discussion. So one of the things, David, you've given us is just that stimulus to keep thinking and keep talking. But I think I can imagine as we resume our bushwalking, there's going to be a few conversations around these ideas, and starting with something like, did you hear David talk? And what did you think? And it's a great place to get anybody to go. And of course, I suspect that as we get out and about again, our eyes will be slightly more open, perhaps, to some of the conundrums that you're presenting us with. It's, you know, there's a serious situation here, and you've shown us that it's by no means a simple solution. And I think you're quite right. The simple political, simple binary solutions that we often get faced with really are a bit of an insult to our intelligence. And we've got to be more intelligent about how we interact with our land. But anyway, rather than talk about those such things, I'd like to thank you one more time on behalf of the assembled group and those unfortunates who couldn't hear you but will be able to when we send out the link to the recording. Well, thank you so much for allowing us to record you. It really is a pleasure to have had you visit us, and I'm glad we've been able to do it without adding air miles to the CO2 budget.
Well, good on you. Thanks for the opportunity. I mean, you know, like, hopefully I was just rambling on, but yeah, no, it's important. I think the last thing I would leave everybody with, what I always feel, is that the Earth is an amazingly resilient, you know, it's an amazingly resilient system, and it is changing, and it always has changed. And, you know, we should cherish the beauty that we have and try to preserve it. It's not to say that just to, you know, let it all go to you know, great, you know, let mine it and blow it up and everything. But all the landscapes that have been burnt, they are going to recover, and we can engage in ourselves with that recovery. And I guess to a certain degree, you've got to let go of the regret and look forward, you know, rather than just feeling sad about, you know, about what's happened. I mean, I'm not wanting to see extinctions and everything, but if we can get motivated, we can keep so much more and preserve it. So anyway, thank you very much, and I'll get back to what I'm meant to be doing.
Thank you so much for your time.
No worries.
If everyone can find the little reaction buttons, and or even if you want to turn on your mic and say something wonderful, there's a clapping in the background. That's lovely. What I have discovered with Zoom is that when you've got more than one person speaking, you don't get a crowd speaking, unfortunately. But I think it can be taken as a given that you've got an enthusiastic applause from across the state and territory. So thank you so much.
Yeah, good on you. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right. See you.
Thanks,
Bye.
David.
Bye. Look, for everybody else, we've got about, it's 9:01, so we're really due to be out of here a minute ago. Some of you may be expecting a business meeting, a general meeting, and I do apologize for having robbed you of that opportunity. What I'd perhaps ask you to do is all keep a careful eye out on the Bushwalking New South Wales newsletter when it comes out. Kirsten's been gathering some very good volunteers, and one of the positive effects is the newsletter, which I think looks wonderful and has some really interesting content. So I just ask you to keep a lookout for that. We'll keep you updated on what Bushwalking New South Wales is doing, and we ask the clubs to keep us updated, and we'll put your little reports in the newsletter. So I think rather than spoil the evening with business stuff, I'd like to draw the meeting to a close and thank all of you for attending, and thank Kirsten for putting this up. It's been a nice steep learning curve for her. It's always good to see people learning new skills. David's done a wonderful job keeping an eye on all your questions, and I realized afterwards, of course, he's going to get 10 times as many questions as we can deal with, but you know, he's got broad shoulders. He's a one, and he's, I think, managed to capture the essence of a number of the questions. And again, if you've got other questions, keep discussing them, follow up some of those links. The Wilder Than Wild film does sound like an interesting something, and maybe a community action is to get your local community cinemas and cinema clubs, if not the mainstream cinemas, but certainly some of your local ones, might be interested in seeing if it can be shown more widely. It does sound like it's an interesting take on the issues we've heard about this evening. I noticed Kirsten's put the sharing of polls up, and Kirsten, you're happy we've got some more data to share with people who need to know these things. It looks like
there was quite a significant impact, as you can see from the poll results, that 36% of attendees had over 20 days of good exercise in nature appreciation. That was not possible to continue over this bushfire period, which is a great shame.
I'm just losing Kirsten's voice. I don't know if we're all losing her. But
sorry about that.
There we go. No, that's okay. So yeah, we're getting, we've got some interesting information there, and I think this reflects the length of the bushfire season. I would say we'd have a similar sort of result from the last couple of months of reduced activity. I would always be interested if anybody's got nice ideas, they can send me an email at my president's email address. Have you found other ways of covering your bushwalking interests when you've not been allowed to get into the bushwalking areas? I'm asking that question at a number of fora. You know, what's the clever ways we've done? We're clever people. What have we done to maintain our interests and our exercise when we've been restricted? I'll leave that one floating out there in the ether, and I would say thank you everyone and close the meeting at what I've got is 9:05. So thank you everybody.
Thank you.